NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang.
Well, Jensen Huang making news, like you said, specifically at the Morgan Stanley Tech Conference. The NVIDIA CEO saying that
NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang called it the single most important release of software probably ever.
One man helped build the company powering the AI boom, the future of robotics, and maybe the next $5 trillion giant? Jensen Huang didn't just create a chip company. He built NVIDIA into the brain behind artificial intelligence. From gaming graphics to data centers, self-driving cars, and AI systems changing the world, his vision was always bigger than the moment. In 1993, he co-founded NVIDIA with a bold belief: computing would become visual, intelligent, and massively powerful. At first, NVIDIA became famous for gaming chips. But Jensen saw something bigger. He realized the same GPUs that power graphics could also power artificial intelligence. That one idea changed everything. So how did a startup founder turn NVIDIA into one of the most powerful companies on Earth? And what is the dark side behind it? This is the story of Jensen Huang's $5 trillion vision.
The foundation, how I became Jensen Huang. When people look at me today, they usually see the version of the story that came later. They see the CEO, they see the leather jacket, they see NVIDIA. They see artificial intelligence, trillion-dollar market value, revolutionary chips, and a company that became one of the most powerful forces in modern technology. But that is not where my story began. My story did not begin in a boardroom. It did not begin with wealth. It did not begin with certainty. It began with confusion, distance, work, discomfort, and the strange way life sometimes prepares you for the future, long before you understand what it is doing. I was born in 1,963 inches, Taiwan, and like many children, I had no idea what path my life would take. I could not have imagined that one day I would help build a company that would power gaming, supercomputing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and industries that had not even fully formed yet. At that age, the future is invisible. You do not see outcomes. You only see moments. And one of the earliest defining moments of my life came when I was sent away as a child. When I was around 9 years old, my family made a decision they believed would help create a better future for me. I was sent to the United States, to a boarding school in rural Kentucky. My family thought they were sending me to a proper preparatory school, the kind of place that would give a young boy structure, discipline, and opportunity. But there was one problem. It was not the kind of school they thought it was. It turned out to be a school for difficult youth. Imagine that for a moment. You are a child. You are far from home. You are in a country that feels unfamiliar. You are placed in an environment you did not choose and barely understand. And now you must learn how to survive in it. That experience changes you. When you are that young, you do not process hardship in polished language. You do not sit there and say, yes, this is building resilience. No, you just feel the pressure. You feel the discomfort, you feel the loneliness, you feel the need to adapt, and adaptation became one of the great themes of my life. I learned very early that the world is not going to rearrange itself for your comfort. You have to learn how to enter difficult situations, understand them, and find a way forward anyway. A lot of people later called me disciplined, focused, driven, and intense. Those qualities were not downloaded into me from nowhere. They were forged in moments where I had to learn how to function without ideal conditions. That school, strange as it was, taught me that environment does not define destiny unless you allow it to. You can begin in a place that feels completely wrong for you and still build a life that is deeply right. One of the earliest jobs I had there was cleaning toilets. People often hear that detail and pause. Some are surprised I mention it. But I mention it because it matters. It matters because it strips away fantasy. There is a myth people love to tell about success. They imagine that the future belongs to people who begin with elegant plans, perfect confidence, ideal timing, and some visible sign that greatness has chosen them. That is not how life worked for me. I cleaned toilets. That was the reality. And there is something important about work like that. It teaches you that no task is beneath you if the mission is bigger than your ego. It teaches humility in a very practical way. It teaches discipline when nobody is applauding. It teaches responsibility before prestige. It teaches you to do the work in front of you. That lesson stayed with me. Much later, when I would be involved in designing products of staggering complexity, building teams, leading engineers, making high-stakes decisions, and steering a company through difficult markets, the mindset was still the same in many ways. Do the work in front of you. Do it well. Do not romanticize the process. Respect the task, even when it is difficult or unglamorous. The world often celebrates outcomes, but outcomes are built from habits, and habits are built in ordinary moments. Later, I also worked as a dishwasher at Denny's. Again, not glamorous, not the kind of job people put at the center of a legend, but those jobs matter. I have always believed that humble work can shape you in profound ways, especially if you let it. A restaurant teaches rhythm. It teaches urgency. It teaches teamwork. It teaches that if one person fails to do their part, the whole system feels it. It teaches standards. It teaches endurance. It teaches you what it means to be useful. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you that effort compounds. When you are washing dishes, no one dish changes your life. But you wash one, then another, then another. And by the end of the shift, what looked overwhelming has been transformed through repetition, discipline, and consistency. That principle applies to almost everything meaningful in life. You do not build a career in one brilliant burst. You do not build mastery in one inspired afternoon. You do not build a company in one bold speech. You build it in layers. One decision, one skill, one sacrifice, one lesson, one hard day at a time. People sometimes ask me where my work ethic came from. I think part of it came from those early experiences. When you have done humble work, real work, tiring work, repetitive work, you stop fantasizing about shortcuts. You understand that almost everything worthwhile has a cost. And if you are willing to pay that cost longer than most people, you begin to create distance between yourself and the crowd. But grit alone is not enough. Hard work matters. Humility matters. Discipline matters. But I also became obsessed with understanding how things worked. I was drawn toward engineering because engineering felt like a language for turning thought into reality. It was not just about theory. It was about structure, precision, systems, trade-offs, cause and effect. It was about solving real problems in a world that does not reward vague thinking. Engineering appealed to me because it sits at the intersection of imagination and discipline. Anybody can dream. Engineering asks, can you build? That question fascinated me, so I pursued that path seriously. I earned my Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Oregon State University. That period of my life was deeply important, not just academically, but mentally. University gave me a more formal framework for the instincts I had already begun to develop. I was no longer just learning how to work hard. I was learning how to think with rigor. Electrical engineering is not forgiving. You cannot bluff your way through it. Systems either work or they do not. Calculations are either right or wrong. Designs either hold or fail. There is beauty in that. There is honesty in it. It teaches you respect for reality, and that, I think, is one of the most valuable traits any builder can have. Respect for reality. A lot of people fall in love with ideas. Engineers must also fall in love with constraints, because constraints are not the enemy of innovation. Often, they are the engine of it. At Oregon State, I sharpened my technical foundation, but I was still hungry to go deeper. I wanted to operate closer to the frontier of what was possible. That led me to pursue my master's degree in electrical engineering at Stanford. Stanford mattered for a different reason. It placed me closer to the center of technological ambition. There is a certain kind of energy that exists in environments where talented people are trying to build the future. It is contagious. It raises your standard. It expands your imagination. It forces you to ask not only, what can I do, but what should I attempt? That distinction is everything. Many people organize their lives around what seems safe, manageable, and immediately realistic. But the future is usually built by people who are willing to ask much larger questions. At Stanford, and in the broader world of technology surrounding it, I could feel that possibility more clearly. I could see that engineering was not just a profession, it was leverage. It was a way to influence the direction of industries, products, and eventually perhaps entire eras of computing. Still, education alone does not make you ready. Sooner or later, you have to leave the classroom and face the brutal elegance of the real world. Before NVIDIA, I worked as an engineer at AMD and later at LSI Logic. Those years were critical. They were my apprenticeship in the real machinery of the semiconductor world. A lot of people see chips as small objects, tiny pieces of silicon, components, hardware, something buried inside a machine. But if you work in semiconductors, you realize very quickly that chips are not just parts. They are decisions made physical. Every chip is a set of priorities, a set of trade-offs, a set of assumptions about what matters most. Speed or cost, power or efficiency, flexibility or specialization, present needs or future potential. To design microprocessors is to think at a level where precision and vision must coexist. At AMD, I learned from one of the most important battlefields in computing, the fight to build faster, better, more capable processors. You are dealing with complexity at an almost unforgiving level. The work teaches discipline because the margin for error is small. It teaches clarity because confusion in chip design is expensive. It teaches collaboration because no meaningful semiconductor product is built alone. Then at LSI Logic, I continued learning the realities of designing and shipping advanced technology. This was not the world of abstract ideas. It was the world of deadlines, manufacturing, product pressure, market demands, and technical trade-offs that have real consequences. Those jobs taught me the deeper architecture of the technology business, not just how chips are designed, but how products succeed, how teams work, how execution matters as much as insight, how timing can transform a good idea into a great company or a failed one. One thing became increasingly clear to me during those years. Computing was going to become far more visual, more dynamic, and more demanding than most people realized. That belief did not arrive in one dramatic flash. It emerged gradually. From pattern recognition, you watch the industry, you study the products, you understand the constraints, and you begin to sense where the world is going. At that time, many parts of computing were still limited by the assumptions of the moment. But I believed a shift was coming. The future of computing would require far more parallel processing power. Graphics would become central, not peripheral. Visual computing would become a major platform, not a niche feature. That idea would eventually become one of the foundational beliefs behind NVIDIA. But before I could build NVIDIA, I had to build myself. And that is something people often overlook. They want the company before the character. They want the breakthrough before the formation. They want the giant outcome before the invisible preparation. But life usually does not work that way. Before there is a company, there is a person learning how to think. Before there is leadership, there is hardship teaching humility. Before there is a vision, there is years of pattern recognition. Before there is success, there is often uncelebrated work that nobody notices. If I look back on the years between 1963 and 1992, I do not see a straight line. I see a series of experiences that seemed separate at the time but were, in reality, connected. Taiwan gave me my beginning. Kentucky gave me resilience. Cleaning toilets gave me humility. Washing dishes gave me endurance. Oregon State gave me technical structure. Stanford gave me expanded ambition. AMD and LSI Logic gave me industry fluency. Piece by piece, I was being prepared, not for comfort, not for ease, but for the burden and opportunity of building something difficult. And I think that is one of the great truths of meaningful success. It is usually assembled from experiences that do not look important while you are living through them. The difficult school, the dirty job, the exhausting shift, the hard class, the demanding manager, the project that forces you to grow, the years when no one outside your immediate circle knows your name. Those years matter. In fact, they may matter most. Because if you cannot carry obscurity well, success will not save you. If you cannot work with humility, power will distort you. If you cannot handle discomfort, innovation will break you. If you cannot learn continuously, the future will outrun you. By the early 1990s, I had become more than a hardworking immigrant engineer. I had become someone with a deep conviction that a massive technological shift was coming. The question was no longer whether I could have a respectable career in engineering. The question was whether I was willing to risk that career to build something that did not yet fully exist. That is a terrifying question, by the way. People love to celebrate entrepreneurship after it works. But before it works, entrepreneurship often looks irrational. It looks unstable. It looks dangerous. It looks like stepping away from certainty into a fog of possibility. And yet, that is exactly where many important things are born. By 1992, the foundation had been laid. Not the foundation of NVIDIA as a company, at least not yet. The foundation of me as a builder. I had learned that hardship does not have to harden you in the wrong way. It can sharpen you. I had learned that humble jobs can prepare you for high responsibility. I had learned that engineering is not merely technical, it is philosophical. It is a way of confronting reality with rigor and creativity at the same time. I had learned that systems matter, details matter, and execution matters. And I had learned something perhaps most important of all, that if you can see a future others do not yet fully see, and if you are willing to work long enough and hard enough for it, then impossible things sometimes become inevitable. That belief would lead me into the next chapter of my life. The chapter where I would stop preparing and start building. The chapter where an idea would become a company. The chapter where risk would become destiny. That chapter would be called NVIDIA. But before NVIDIA became a revolution in computing, it was simply the next impossible thing I chose to believe in. And maybe that is the real lesson from my foundation. Great companies are not usually born from comfort. They are born from conviction. And conviction, if it is real, is almost always forged long before the world sees the result. So when people ask me how NVIDIA began, I tell them it did not begin in 1993. It began much earlier. It began when a young boy found himself in the wrong school and learned to adapt. It began when that boy cleaned toilets and learned humility. It began when he washed dishes and learned endurance. It began when he studied engineering and discovered the joy of solving hard problems. It began when he entered the semiconductor industry and saw hints of a future no one had fully built yet. In other words, NVIDIA began in all the moments that made me capable of building it. And if there is anything I would want other people to understand from my early story, it is this. Do not underestimate your hard beginnings. Do not despise humble work. Do not assume that struggle means you are off course. Some of the most important preparation in life arrives disguised as inconvenience, disappointment, confusion, and effort. But if you meet those moments with discipline, curiosity, and resilience, they can become the raw materials of something extraordinary. That was my foundation, and everything that came later stood on it. Chapter 2, the billion-dollar bet at Denny's, how I built NVIDIA when it nearly died. People love the clean version of success. They love the headline version. They love the version where a company starts with a bold idea, works exactly as planned, changes the world, and makes everyone involved rich. That version is neat. It is inspiring. And most of the time, it is completely false. The truth is much messier. When people talk about NVIDIA today, they see one of the most important technology companies in the world. They see artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, gaming, data centers, robotics, and a company whose influence stretches across industries. They see scale, they see certainty, they see dominance. But when I think back to the beginning, I do not remember certainty. I remember risk. I remember discomfort. I remember sitting in a Denny's in 1993 with two brilliant engineers, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, talking about a future that did not yet exist in any reliable form. And that moment mattered more than most people realize. Because companies do not usually begin with proof. They begin with belief. In 1993, we met at the same kind of ordinary place where big dreams often looked the least believable, a booth at Denny's. For me, there was something strangely poetic about that. I had once worked in a Denny's as a dishwasher. Years earlier, I had been cleaning dishes, doing humble work, learning the rhythm of effort. Now I was back in that kind of place, not to wash plates, but to discuss an idea that might shape the future of computing. That contrast stayed with me. Life has a strange sense of symmetry sometimes. There we were, sketching out the possibility of a company focused on something that many people had not yet fully grasped: the future importance of specialized chips for 3D graphics. Today, it sounds obvious. Of course, graphics matter. Of course, visual computing would become enormous. Of course, video games would drive massive technological demand. Of course, parallel processing would become foundational for future breakthroughs. But at the time, none of that was obvious in the way it is now. What we saw was a technological shift beginning to form. Computers were becoming more powerful. Visual experiences were becoming more important. Games were becoming more complex. Interfaces were becoming richer. There was a growing need for chips designed not just for general purpose processing, but for handling the intense workload of graphical computation. That was the key idea. Not just to make another chip, not just to compete on conventional terms, but to build something specialized, something capable of handling complex 3D graphics in a way that would open the door to an entirely new class of computing experiences. That was the bet. And it was a real bet. A real bet is not an idea you talk about casually. A real bet costs something. It costs security. It costs reputation. It costs comfort. It costs years of your life that you cannot get back if you are wrong. Starting NVIDIA was not a fashionable move. It was not the kind of decision where everyone around us said, yes, clearly this is a guaranteed future giant. No, it was uncertain, technical, difficult, and risky. That is why I say it was $1 billion bet at Denny's. Not because it looked like $1 billion that day. It did not. It looked like a conversation, a sketch, a hypothesis, a conviction shared by a few people willing to believe in a market before the market had fully arrived. That is often what the beginning of a great company looks like. Not certainty, just a few people with enough clarity to see something coming and enough courage to act before the rest of the world agrees. Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem were extraordinary technical minds. One of the most important things in building a company is not just the idea itself, but the people who are willing to carry it with you. A startup is too difficult for vanity partnerships. The work is too demanding. The pressure is too intense. The uncertainty is too constant. You need people who are real, people who can build, people who can endure, people who can tell the truth when the truth is uncomfortable, people who care more about getting it right than about being admired. That matters. So when we came together, it wasn't just that we shared an interest in graphics. We shared a willingness to pursue something difficult. And from the beginning, NVIDIA was difficult. I think people sometimes imagine founding a company as a thrilling and glamorous act. In reality, it is often a prolonged confrontation with ignorance, risk, and limitations. You do not know enough. You do not have enough money. You do not have enough time. You do not have enough people. The market is not mature. Customers are uncertain. Competitors are moving. Technology shifts underneath you. And yet, you keep going. That was our life. In those early years, we were trying to build a new kind of company in a fast-changing industry. We were not simply following a well-lit road. We were making bets about where the road would go. One of the earliest products we created was NV1. At the time, we believed it had a chance to define our entry into the graphics market. We were trying to build something advanced, something capable, something that could help establish us as a serious technology company in a rapidly evolving space. But here is the part people often leave out of startup mythology. Sometimes your first big product fails, and not in a gentle way, not in a way where everyone says, nice try, better luck next time. Sometimes it fails in a way that threatens the existence of the entire company. That is what happened with NV1. It was, in commercial terms, a flop. That word matters because it is honest. It did not become the breakthrough we needed. It did not land the way we hoped. It did not establish NVIDIA as the winner. It did not secure our future. Instead, it pushed us toward the edge. This is the part of the story where the emotional reality becomes important. When you are running a startup and a major product fails, the failure is not abstract. It is not a case study. It is personal. It enters the room with you. It affects payroll. It affects confidence. It affects your credibility with investors, employees, partners, and customers. It affects your ability to keep believing when belief becomes expensive. And belief was becoming very expensive. We were in serious trouble. Not things are a little difficult trouble. Real trouble. The kind of trouble that makes you stare directly at the possibility that the company may not survive. I have often said that CEOs are forged in pain. I believe that because leadership is easy to imitate when everything is working. When revenue is growing, products are succeeding, and the market is celebrating you, many people can look competent, but real leadership is revealed when things are breaking. What do you do when the strategy fails? What do you do when time is running out? What do you do when the thing you built does not work in the market the way you expected? What do you do when hope alone is no longer enough? That is where I found myself in the mid-1990s. To survive, I had to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. We had to lay off 70% of the staff. There is no glamorous way to say that. No polished entrepreneurial language can remove the human weight of it. These were people, talented people. People who had believed in the mission. People who had committed their time and energy to building something with us. And now I had to tell many of them that the company could not carry them forward. That kind of moment changes you. It strips away illusion. It forces you to confront the cost of leadership. It teaches you that building a company is not only about vision, it is also about responsibility, consequences, and difficult choices made under pressure. I did not enjoy that decision. No real leader does, but sometimes survival demands choices that hurt. And I learned something critical in that period. When your company is in crisis, denial is not compassion. Delay is not kindness. False optimism is not leadership. Clarity is leadership. Action is leadership. Facing reality quickly enough to preserve the future, that is leadership. So we did not just cut staff. We did something even more fundamental. We pivoted the company's entire architecture. That is not a small sentence. To pivot architecture is to say, the assumptions behind what we were building are no longer good enough. The technical path we were on is not going to save us. The company we thought we were building must now become something else if it wants to live. That is terrifying. Because once you make that decision, there is no comfortable middle ground. You are no longer defending the past. You are betting everything on the future. And if you are wrong again, that may be the end. This is one of the reasons I believe founders need conviction paired with adaptability. Conviction without adaptability becomes stubbornness. Adaptability without conviction becomes drift. To survive in technology, especially at the frontier, you need both. You must know what matters deeply enough to stay committed. And you must be flexible enough to change what no longer works. That is what we did. We reevaluated the market. We reevaluated the technical path. We reevaluated what kind of product could actually win. The gaming industry was evolving fast. 3D graphics were becoming more central, more demanding, more commercially important. The opportunity was still there, but we had to align ourselves with where the market was actually going, not where we wished it had gone. This is one of the hardest disciplines in business, distinguishing between your theory and reality. Founders fall in love with their ideas. Markets reward only what works. And if you cannot update your strategy when reality disagrees with you, the market will punish you without mercy. So we rebuilt, and rebuilding after near death is a different kind of work than starting. Starting is filled with enthusiasm. Rebuilding is filled with urgency. Starting often has optimism. Rebuilding has scars. Starting asks, what if this works? Rebuilding asks, what must be true for us to survive? Those years shaped NVIDIA at the deepest level. They taught us discipline. They taught us speed. They taught us the necessity of bold decisions made with incomplete information. They taught us that survival is sometimes the first great innovation. People now look at NVIDIA and see enormous capability in execution. But that culture was not formed in easy years. It was formed in moments where failure was close enough to feel on your skin. We learned to move faster because slow death was not acceptable. We learned to focus because distraction was expensive. We learned to tell the truth because fantasy was lethal. And out of that crucible came one of the most important breakthroughs in our company's history. In 1999, NVIDIA released the GeForce 256. That product changed everything. We called it the world's first GPU graphics processing unit. Now, that phrase is everywhere. Today, GPU is a foundational concept in computing. It powers gaming, simulation, scientific computing, machine learning, AI training, autonomous systems, rendering, and so much more. But at the time, calling GeForce 256 a GPU was not just marketing language. It was an attempt to name a shift. We believed we were no longer building just another graphics chip. We were defining a new category of computing. That distinction matters. A graphics chip sounds like a component. A GPU sounds like a platform. And platforms change industries. The GeForce 256 was powerful because it integrated advanced transformation, lighting, rendering, and 3D processing capabilities in a way that changed what developers and gamers could expect from a graphics system. It did not merely improve existing experiences, it expanded the horizon of what was possible. This is where product breakthroughs become larger than product specs. When a truly important technology arrives, it does not just perform better, it changes the imagination of the market. Developers begin building differently. Customers begin expecting more. Industries begin reorganizing around new standards. That is what happened. The gaming industry was revolutionized. Graphics became richer. Performance became more central. The demand for high-end visual computing accelerated. And NVIDIA moved from a struggling company that had nearly died to a defining force in a major technological shift. That turnaround was not luck. It was the result of surviving long enough to find the right architecture, the right product, and the right moment. Timing matters enormously in technology. A great product too early can fail. A mediocre product at the right time can succeed. But a great product at the right time that can transform a company, GeForce 256 was that kind of moment for NVIDIA. And with that breakthrough came another milestone. NVIDIA went public in 1999. The IPO mattered financially, of course. It provided capital, credibility, and market validation. It marked NVIDIA's arrival as a serious public company rather than just a scrappy startup trying to survive. But to me, the deeper meaning of the IPO was not that we had become successful, it was that we had earned the right to keep building. An IPO is not the end of a journey. It is a transition. It gives you a stronger base from which to pursue larger ambitions. And for NVIDIA, those ambitions would continue expanding far beyond gaming. Still, I would be lying if I said the moment held no emotional meaning. Think about what that year represented. A few years earlier, the company had nearly failed. Our first major chip had flopped. We had laid off the majority of the staff. We had rebuilt under pressure. We had bet everything on a new direction. And now, in 1999, we had launched a breakthrough product and taken the company public. That kind of arc teaches you something unforgettable. The line between failure and success is often thinner than people think. Many companies do not fail because the original idea had no value. They fail because they run out of time, courage, adaptability, or discipline before finding the right expression of the idea. We were fortunate enough and determined enough to find ours. That period also laid the groundwork for my eventual rise toward billionaire status. Not instantly, not in a straight line, and not without many future battles. But the IPO was one of the key structural events that made everything later possible. People sometimes assume wealth is created in a single explosive moment. In reality, major wealth is often built through layers of technical conviction, company survival, category creation, and long-term execution. The IPO was one layer. The GeForce 256 was another. The pivot after NV1 was another. Even the pain of layoffs and near bankruptcy was part of the structure, because those experiences did not just save NVIDIA. They shaped how we would think for decades. They taught us never to become complacent. They taught us to build platforms, not just products. They taught us to look beyond the current market and toward the next computing wave. They taught us that survival through one crisis can create the confidence to face much larger opportunities later. And perhaps most importantly, they taught me personally what kind of leader I needed to become. Not a leader addicted to comfort, not a leader who needs constant approval, not a leader who confuses confidence with inflexibility, but a leader willing to endure uncertainty, face brutal facts, and still keep building. If I look back on 1993 to 1999, I do not see a fairy tale startup success. I see a test of whether an idea was strong enough, a test of whether a team was resilient enough, a test of whether I, as a founder, was honest and adaptive enough to steer the company through failure without losing the larger vision. That was the real billion-dollar bet. It was not just the belief that graphics mattered. It was the belief that we could survive long enough to matter with them. And that is an important difference, because ideas alone do not build companies. Survival does. Execution does. Timing does. Leadership does. The willingness to be rebuilt by difficulty does. By the end of the decade, NVIDIA had gone from an uncertain startup conceived at Denny's to a public company whose technology was reshaping gaming. But what most people did not yet fully understand was this: gaming was only the beginning. The GPU would become far more important than the world then realized. What began as a specialized engine for graphics would eventually become one of the foundational technologies of the modern age. It would power simulation. It would accelerate scientific computing. It would transform data centers. It would become essential to artificial intelligence. It would help shape the next era of computing itself. But in 1999, that future was still mostly hidden. All we knew for sure was that we had survived, and survival, when earned honestly, has a way of creating the next horizon. So when people ask me what the early NVIDIA years felt like, I tell them this: they felt fragile. They felt intense. They felt uncertain. They felt brutally educational. And they taught me lessons I could not have learned any other way. I learned that a company can come frighteningly close to death and still recover. I learned that the first product does not have to define the final outcome. I learned that laying off people may save a mission, but it should leave a scar serious enough that you never treat such decisions casually. I learned that technical architecture matters because strategic architecture matters. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing a founder can do is not to protect their pride, but to protect the future, even if it requires abandoning the thing they originally believed would get them there. That is what chapter 2 of my life was really about. Not just the founding of NVIDIA, not just the flop of NV1, not just the breakthrough of GeForce 256. It was about transformation under pressure. It was about discovering whether a fragile company could become a category-defining one. It was about whether an engineer with a big belief, sitting in a Denny's with 2 co-founders, could turn a sketch into a platform that would one day influence the world. And the answer, as it turned out, was yes. But only because we were willing to be humbled first. Only because we failed. Only because we almost disappeared. Only because we changed. That is the part of success people do not always like to hear. But it is often the truest part. NVIDIA did not become powerful because we avoided pain. NVIDIA became powerful because we were shaped by it. And if there is anything I would want another founder, engineer, builder, or dreamer to understand from those years, it is this: do not assume your first failure is your final identity. Do not assume a near-death moment means the vision was worthless. Do not confuse setback with destiny. Sometimes the thing that nearly destroys your company is the thing that forces it to become what it was actually meant to be. That was our story between 1993 and 1999. A company born in belief, a company nearly broken by reality, a company saved by adaptation, a company transformed by one breakthrough product, and a founder who learned that the road to extraordinary outcomes is very rarely smooth, but often worth every brutal mile. That was the billion-dollar bet at Denny's. And in many ways, it was only the beginning. Chapter 3, the incredible pivot to AI, how I turned NVIDIA from a gaming chip company into an AI powerhouse. If you had asked most people in the mid-2000s what NVIDIA was, they would have given you a simple answer: a gaming company. And to be fair, that answer made sense. We were known for making graphics chips. We built processors that made video games look better, run faster, and feel more immersive. To the outside world, that was our lane. That was our identity. That was what people thought we were built for. But I never saw NVIDIA as just a gaming company. I saw something bigger. I saw that the technology we were building for graphics could eventually do something far more important than rendering explosions, shadows, and textures in a game. I believed our chips could become the engine for a completely new era of computing. That belief changed everything. And at the time, almost nobody agreed with me. Seeing what others missed, the key insight was simple, but it wasn't obvious to most people. Traditional CPUs were built to do a small number of complicated tasks in sequence, one after another, extremely well. They were brilliant at general-purpose computing. They were the kings of the old world of computing. But GPUs were different. GPUs were designed for parallel processing. Instead of doing one thing at a time, they could do many things at once. That was necessary for graphics, because rendering an image means calculating huge numbers of pixels, shapes, lighting effects, textures, and movements simultaneously. Most people looked at that and saw gaming hardware. I looked at it and saw a new computing model. I started asking myself a different question. What if the future of computing isn't just faster sequential logic? What if the future belongs to massively parallel computation? That question became one of the most important questions of my life. Because if parallel processing was going to matter beyond graphics, then GPUs were not just graphics processors. They were something much more powerful. They were a new kind of computer. The bet that scared everyone. In 2006, we launched something that many people outside the company didn't fully understand. It was called CUDA. CUDA was not just another product release. It was not just another feature. It was a fundamental strategic bet on the future of computing. CUDA was a software platform that allowed developers, engineers, and researchers to program NVIDIA GPUs for general-purpose computing tasks. In other words, instead of using GPUs only to draw images, you could use them to solve scientific problems, run simulations, process enormous data sets, and eventually power artificial intelligence. Today, that may sound obvious. Back then, it sounded crazy. We were spending enormous amounts of money building a software ecosystem for a market that barely existed. We were investing in tools, compilers, libraries, developer support, educational resources, and long-term platform infrastructure before most of the world even believed this direction mattered. Wall Street did not like that. Investors often want clear, immediate returns. They want predictability.